Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling a figure you might not know right off the bat. Antoine Legrand. He was a 17th century philosopher, and he's really a key figure in understanding how the ideas of René Descartes really took root, especially in England. Think of him as like the bridge between Descartes' very radical views and a world that was still very much steeped in Aristotle.
Exactly. He's a fascinating case study in how philosophical movements gain traction.
Right. Yeah. So we're basing this deep dive on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Legrand. But before we get into like all the details and the really complex stuff, let me ask, why should a modern philosophy buff even care about this guy?
That's a great question, and it's easy to think of figures like this as just kind of historical curiosities, but Legrand's work is actually surprisingly relevant.
Okay.
He was wrestling with problems that still plague philosophers today, like the mind-body problem, the nature of causation, and even the question of whether eternal truths depend on God's will.
Ooh, get deep right off the bat.
Yeah.
So let's start with the man himself. The Stanford Encyclopedia paints a picture of a life that was, well, anything but boring. Born in Douai, became a Franciscan friar, ends up in England in 1656.
Wow.
Not just as a Catholic missionary, but like a full-on Cartesian evangelist.
Talk about a bold move, 17th century. England wasn't exactly known for its open-mindedness when it came to either Catholicism or radical new philosophies.
No kidding. And the reactions he got were wild. Cambridge seems to welcome him, possibly because of the influence of Neoplatonists who were already kind of open to some Cartesian ideas.
Right.
But Oxford, total shutdown.
Yeah.
His work was actually banned there.
It really shows you the power dynamics at play even back then in those intellectual circles.
Yeah.
Samuel Parker, a really big name at Oxford, saw Cartesianism as a slippery slope to atheism, basically lumping it in with Thomas Hobbes's philosophy. So
wow.
Legrand was walking into a hornet's nest.
Yeah, he actually wrote a whole book, Apologia pro Renato Descartes, defending Descartes against those very charges.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, but let's get to the works that kind of made him famous. His Institutio Philosophiae, published in 1672, became required reading at Cambridge.
Imagine that your philosophy textbook being the book at one of the most prestigious universities.
I know.
It really says a lot about how influential Legrand became, at least in certain circles.
Yeah. And then there's an entire body of philosophy. According to the principles of the famous René Descartes, published in 1694, as the title suggests.
Right.
It's a full-blown systematization of Descartes' thought.
It's a testament to his deep understanding and commitment to those Cartesian principles.
Yeah.
He really saw himself as building upon the foundation that Descartes had laid.
Okay, so we've got a guy who is seriously dedicated to Descartes' mind-body dualism, the whole 9 yards. But he doesn't just parrot the ideas.
Right.
The Stanford Encyclopedia points out that he develops them, especially when it comes to a very tricky concept. And that's the concept of motion.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. Legrand takes a very firm stance. God is the ultimate source of all motion matter, he argues, is completely passive, and bodies can't move themselves, let alone each other.
So every time a ball rolls or a planet spins, it's a direct act of God.
That's right.
That seems to put a lot on God's plate.
It does, but that's where Legrand's concept of secondary causes comes in.
Okay.
He's not saying that God micromanages every little movement.
Right.
Instead, he creates the universe with a set of laws and properties.
Okay.
And then those properties determine how things behave.
So it's like God is the billiards player setting up the shot.
Exactly.
And the balls move according to the angles and the forces involved.
Right.
But the initial impetus, that first strike, that's all God.
That's right. The balls, or in this case material bodies, are merely instruments in God's grand design. They have no inherent power to move themselves.
This is a far cry from just saying God created the universe and let it run.
Yeah.
This is like, Legrand is like deeply embedded in the workings of the physical world. It even makes you wonder, is he closer to occasionalism than standard Cartesianism?
That's a good question, and it's one that scholars debate to this day.
I can imagine.
Legrand is walking a very fine line.
Yeah.
He emphasizes God's direct involvement in motion.
Right.
But he also talks about universal laws and the created nature of those laws.
Right.
It's a very nuanced position that we'll need to unpack further as we go.
It definitely raises some intriguing questions, I think, for anyone who's familiar with, the debates around causation.
Oh, yeah.
And determinism. But before we go down that rabbit hole, we need to address the elephant in the room.
Oh, boy.
The mind-body problem.
Ah, yes, the classic Cartesian dilemma.
Yes. How can an immaterial mind possibly interact with a material body?
Mhm.
Descartes himself struggled to give a satisfying answer,
And-
but Legrand tackles it head-on.
Really?
And his solution, you guessed it, involves God.
Okay, I'm sensing a pattern here.
Right. So how does God fix this mind-body conundrum according to Legrand?
Well, he sees God as the ultimate mediator. The bridge between these two seemingly incompatible realms. God is the one who allows mind and body to interact and even to form a union.
But we can't just say God did it and call it a day.
Mm.
How does this union actually work? What's the mechanism?
Well, Legrand proposes 3 types of union.
Okay.
First, you have minds united by love, which is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Then there's bodies united by physical proximity.
Okay.
Think of objects touching or connected in some way.
Okay.
But the really interesting one is the union of mind and body, which Legrand attributes to mutual dependency.
Mutual dependency. So that sounds like they need each other to function.
Exactly.
Okay.
The mind depends on the body for sensations, for experiencing the physical world.
Right.
And the body depends on the mind for direction, intention, all those things that make us conscious agents. It's this interweaving of activities, this constant interplay that constitutes their union.
So it's not just that God brings them together.
Right.
It's that they're actively engaged in a sort of cosmic dance with God as the choreographer, making sure they move in harmony.
That's a wonderful analogy.
Thanks.
And it highlights the dynamic nature of that mind-body relationship as Legrand conceived of it.
This is already making me rethink how I understand that whole Cartesian system.
I can imagine.
But Legrand doesn't stop there. He's not content with just abstract metaphysical puzzles.
No.
He wants to apply these principles to the real world, to the natural world.
And that's where we see the true scope of his project. He tackles everything: metals, plants, insects, even the human body itself.
Wow.
He's showing that Cartesian principles aren't just for philosophers pondering the nature of reality. They can actually explain the world we experience, the world we observe.
So he's not just an armchair philosopher. He's out there trying to show that this system can account for the nitty-gritty details of the natural world.
Exactly. And he stresses the importance of experiments. Not just to confirm theories, but to discover the true nature of things, to uncover God's hidden hand in the workings of creation.
That's fascinating. He sees the study of nature as a religious act,
Yeah.
a way to understand God's plan.
He truly believed that by studying the created world, we could come to a deeper understanding of the Creator.
So we've got a philosopher deeply embedded in Cartesian metaphysics, grappling with motion, mind-body interaction, applying it all to the natural world. But there's a huge piece of the Cartesian puzzle we haven't even touched on yet, and that's ideas and how we know things.
Right, the epistemology.
Yeah.
Legrand follows Descartes pretty closely here, starting with those 3 types of ideas.
Let's hear them refresh my memory.
Sure. So first you have adventitious ideas, the ones we get directly from our senses.
Okay.
Seeing a tree, smelling a flower, that sort of thing.
Okay. Basic sensory input. What else?
Then there are fictitious ideas, creations of the imagination.
Okay.
Unicorns, dragons, anything we dream up or concoct in our minds.
So this stuff of fantasy novels
Exactly.
and daydreams.
Exactly. And finally, there are innate ideas, the ones that Legrand believes are in our minds from the start, not derived from experience.
Right.
They're the foundation of knowledge for him, just like for Descartes.
Yes, those tricky innate ideas.
Yes.
But they lead to a major problem, which Descartes also ran into.
Right.
If, as Descartes argued, our ideas don't actually resemble the objects they represent,
Right.
how do we know they're accurate? How do we know they correspond to reality?
That is the million-dollar question.
Yes.
And Legrand comes up with a very interesting solution, and he calls it substitution or supplying a stead.
Substitution. Now, I'm really intrigued. Break that down for me.
Think of it this way. The idea itself might not look like the object,
Okay.
but the fact that the object caused the idea is enough to guarantee its accuracy.
So the causal connection is what matters.
Yes.
Not the resemblance.
Right.
The fact that the tree caused my idea of a tree
Right.
means that the idea is, in a way, standing in for the tree itself.
That's it. Legrand is saying that the object's ability to produce the idea acts as a sort of proxy for resemblance.
Okay, it's a clever way to preserve the idea that we can have true knowledge,
Right.
even if our ideas aren't literal copies of the world.
Exactly.
But I can't let us get away without addressing one of the most controversial parts of Legrand's thought. And that's the idea that eternal truths are actually created by God.
Yes. The creation doctrine, even Descartes was a bit hesitant on this one.
Yeah.
But Legrand jumps in with both feet.
He's not afraid of controversy, so what's his reasoning? How can something be both eternal and created?
He uses the analogy of a king establishing laws.
Okay.
Just as a king's will determines the laws of his kingdom,
Right.
God's will determines the eternal truths that govern the universe.
But that makes it sound like God could have just as easily chosen different truths. Wouldn't that make truth arbitrary?
That's a very common objection.
Yeah.
And Legrand has a response. He says, yes, God could have chosen different truths, but once he made his choice, those truths became necessary. He distinguishes between antecedent and consequent necessity to make this work.
Antecedent and consequent necessity, those sound like philosopher terms.
They are.
What's the difference?
Antecedent necessity means something is necessary in itself, like a logical truth.
Right.
But consequent necessity means something becomes necessary because of something else.
Okay, I see where he's going with this. So in Legrand's view, eternal truths have consequent necessity.
That's right.
They're necessary because God willed them to be so.
Exactly. It's like God saying, in this universe, the angles of a triangle will always add up to 180 degrees.
Right.
That's the rule I'm setting.
Yeah.
And once he sets that rule, it becomes a necessary truth within his creation.
It's a mind-bending idea, for
Mhm.
sure. But if God is the source of all truth, what role is left for human reason? Are we just passively receiving knowledge from God?
Now, that's the question that takes us to the heart of Legrand's epistemology, and it's something we'll explore in more depth in the next part of our deep dive.
I can't wait. This is already making me rethink some fundamental assumptions about the relationship between faith, reason, and the nature of reality.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Antoine Legrand. Before the break, we were wrestling with a big question. If God is the source of all truth, does that leave any room for human reason?
Right. Does Legrand think we're just empty vessels waiting to be filled with, like, divine knowledge? Or do we have an active role to play in discovering truth?
Well, it's not as simple as saying we either have reason or we don't. Legrand actually sees reason as incredibly important, a
Yeah.
faculty that's given to us by God for a specific purpose.
Okay. I'm intrigued, but I'm also sensing a but coming.
There is a but. Legrand might champion reason, but he also recognizes its limits. He makes a clear distinction between our ability to understand eternal truths and our ability to discover them on our own.
So we can grasp these truths once they're revealed to us,
Right.
but we can't come up with them ourselves.
Exactly. He believes God implanted these simple, true, immutable ideas in our minds. Think of them like seeds of knowledge. They're there, but they need something to make them grow.
So the potential for knowledge is innate, but it needs, let's say, some water and sunlight to blossom.
A perfect analogy, and that's where experience comes in Legrand. Like, Descartes believed that observation and experimentation are key. We need that sensory input to activate those innate ideas and turn them into real knowledge.
So it's not an either-or situation, it's a both-and.
Yes.
We need both the capacity for reason and the data of experience to really make sense of the world.
It's a delicate balance and one that really gets to the heart of how we understand the relationship between what's in our minds and what's out there in reality.
It reminds me of how Legrand applied those Cartesian principles to the natural world. He wasn't content just thinking about innate ideas. He wanted to see them in action in the messy, complex world around us.
Absolutely, and that's where his idea of secondary causes becomes so crucial. He's saying, yes, God is the ultimate source of all motion and change, but he works through those secondary causes, these specific properties of matter, to produce the order and the diversity that we see in nature.
So it's like God laid out the blueprint for the universe,
Right.
but nature is the contractor, the builder, actually putting the pieces together according to the plan.
I like that it emphasizes that God's not just a distant watchmaker who set things in motion and walked away.
Right.
He's intimately involved in the workings of his creation.
It also kind of elevates the study of nature, right?
Yes.
If you're uncovering those secondary causes, those law and properties, you're getting a glimpse into the mind of God.
Exactly. For Legrand, natural philosophy wasn't just about understanding the world. It was a pathway to understanding the divine.
This makes his work so much richer than just like a dry academic exercise.
Right.
It's about understanding our place in the cosmos, how we fit into the grand scheme of things.
And for Legrand, that understanding of our place in the cosmos inevitably leads to questions of ethics and morality.
Okay.
How should we live? What is the good life? What is our purpose here?
So even though he's known for metaphysics and physics, he doesn't shy away from the big existential questions.
Not at all. It's fascinating how his views on this actually evolved over time, his early work. Man Without Passions sounds very stoic, almost advocating for the suppression of emotions.
Like we should just shut off our feelings and live by pure reason.
It seems that way at first, but then he shifts toward the Cartesian idea that passions, while potentially disruptive, shouldn't be eliminated but trained. They can be directed towards virtue if we understand them properly.
So it's about channeling those emotions, not denying them. That's a very different approach.
He even tries to reconcile some seemingly opposite views on pleasure, Seneca's Stoicism and Epicureanism, using Descartes' theory of passions as a framework.
Wow, he's bringing together some big names and big ideas here.
He was a true synthesizer, pulling from various traditions to create a more complete ethical picture.
But here's the question that keeps popping into my head. How does Legrand's ethics actually connect with his overall philosophical project?
Right.
Does his understanding of God, the universe, and even the human mind shape his views on how we should live?
That's the core of it. Remember, for Legrand, God isn't some distant entity. He's the ground of being the source of goodness and truth. So ethics for him is about aligning ourselves with that divine order.
So living a good life means living in accordance with God's will.
Exactly. He sees virtue as a way of participating in the divine essence, striving towards the perfection that God embodies.
This reminds me of his concept of mutual dependency and mind-body union. It's like there's a similar kind of dependency in the ethical realm that we need God to guide us towards the good.
You're spot on. Legrand believed that we're fundamentally dependent on God for our existence, our knowledge, and even our capacity for virtue.
Mhm.
But that dependence for him isn't a weakness, it's the source of our strength and fulfillment.
So it's by acknowledging that dependence, by recognizing our place within the grand scheme of things, that we can truly become like the best versions of ourselves.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Legrand's philosophy is an invitation to see ourselves as part of something much bigger than ourselves, to recognize the interconnectedness of all things, and to strive towards a life that reflects the divine order.
This deep dive has been mind-blowing. We've covered metaphysics of physics ethics, all through the lens of this one fascinating figure.
And we've only scratched the surface. Legrand's work is so rich, there's always more to uncover.
I have to admit, I came into this knowing next to nothing about Antoine Legrand. Now I see him as a major player in 17th century thought.
He's often overshadowed by Descartes and Malebranche, but he deserves a spot right there with them.
Absolutely. He tackled some of the biggest questions of his time, and his insights are still relevant today.
That's the mark of a truly great philosopher, one whose ideas transcend time and place, continuing to challenge and inspire us centuries later. But before we get too carried away, I think we need to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the relationship between Legrand's philosophy and his deep theological commitments.
Right? We've talked about how God is central to his explanation of motion-mind-body interaction, even the existence of eternal truths. But how does that theological grounding shape our understanding of his entire philosophical project?
It's a crucial question, and one that gets to the heart of what makes Legrand so fascinating and perhaps so challenging for modern readers.
I'm all ears.
Hmm.
Let's dive into that in our final part of this deep dive.
Oh.
Okay, so we're back, and we've been on quite a journey with Antoine Legrand, haven't we? This 17th century thinker took Cartesianism and really ran with it, pushing those ideas in directions even Descartes might not have anticipated.
He really did, and throughout our deep dive, we've seen how God is not just some background figure for Legrand. He's front and center in his explanation of motion-mind-body interaction, the very existence of eternal truths.
Right, we've touched on how this theological grounding really shapes his whole philosophical project, but I think we need to kind of unpack that a bit more. Like, what are the implications of putting God at the very foundation of your philosophical system?
It's a question that really cuts to the heart of how we understand Legrand, and perhaps even how we approach philosophy itself. Can we truly grasp his ideas, his arguments, his conclusions, without really grappling with the fact that his worldview is so thoroughly rooted in his belief in God?
Yeah, it's like trying to understand a building without knowing anything about its foundation. You might see the walls, the roof, the windows,
Right.
but you wouldn't really get the structural integrity of the whole thing.
Exactly. And I think this raises a particularly interesting question for us as modern readers, perhaps even more so than for Legrand's contemporaries. Does his reliance on God as an explanatory principle strengthen or weaken his philosophical arguments?
That is a tough one.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you could say that it makes his system more complete, more comprehensive,
Yeah.
right? He's not just explaining the physical world or the human mind. He's accounting for their very existence, their ultimate source.
Right. There's a certain elegance to it, a sense of everything fitting together neatly under this umbrella of God's creative power and will.
Yeah. But on the other hand, you could argue that it makes his arguments less convincing, at least to a modern audience,
Yeah.
especially to those who don't share his theological assumptions. It could feel like he's kind of dodging the hard questions, by just saying, well, God did it.
And there's a danger there for sure if we stop questioning, stop seeking deeper explanations just because we've invoked God, then we've abandoned the spirit of philosophical inquiry.
So where does that leave us? How should we approach Legrand's work? Do we have to, like, accept his theological premises to find value in his philosophical insights?
I don't think it's about accepting or rejecting his beliefs wholesale.
Okay.
It's about understanding how those beliefs shape his thinking, how they inform his arguments, and then engaging with those arguments on their own merits.
So we don't have to agree with him to learn from him.
Right.
We can appreciate the rigor of his reasoning, the depth of his analysis, even if we ultimately come to different conclusions.
Exactly. I think that's the beauty of philosophy. It's not about dogma or blind faith. It's about questioning, exploring, wrestling with ideas, even if those ideas challenge our own preconceived notions.
And that's what Legrand did so brilliantly.
Yeah.
Right? He took the ideas of his time, the philosophical and theological currents swirling around him, and he grappled with them, he synthesized them, and ultimately he forged his own unique path.
He did, and in doing so, he left behind a body of work that continues to challenge and inspire us centuries later.
So to our listeners, I encourage you, don't shy away from Legrand, just because he might seem a bit too theologically minded for modern tastes. Dive into his work, wrestle with his ideas, and see what sparks your own philosophical curiosity.
You might find that this 17th century thinker has something surprising to say about the questions we're still grappling with today.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Antoine Legrand. Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.